Hey everyone, welcome back to Empire Prints. Today we are going to be working on a Mandalorian Pre Vizsla helmet, specifically more of a live action realistic look. This file I got over on Etsy from McFly Print 3D. He has some really cool looking files and I really like how this Pre Vizsla helmet looks. I think it's just such a unique look and I'm really excited to start working on it. So let's get into it. As I do with all my helmets, I always start by sanding down the print lines. This is going to save you filler, it's going to save you filler primer. It's way easier to start by just sanding the lines down as much as you can before you put anything on the helmet. I'm starting with the 220 grit. You can start even lower depending on the quality of print that you're working with, but I just give this thing a nice rough sand as much as I can do before we move on to the next step. Now on to my cheat code when it comes to filling in print lines. I use Bondo glazing and spot putty mixed with a little bit of acetone. I always go for a nice watery mixture. It's totally up to you how much acetone you want to add, how much Bondo you want to add, but I like it nice and watery as it dries almost instantly and it's just way easier to work with. So you want to apply 2 to 3 layers throughout the entire helmet. This is pretty much going to get all your 3D print lines except like seam lines and rougher areas. But this does like 90% of the work for you. So I highly recommend doing this to your next helmet. After our Bondo and acetone, I normally give it about 30 minutes to dry. That just kind of depends on your temperature. And then we're gonna hit this thing with 400 grit sandpaper, get it nice and smooth and ready for our first layer of primer. This is a pretty simple step. When you kind of start to see the black filament underneath or whatever color filament you used, I always prefer black as it's just really easy to work with and see. That's how I know I can kind of move on to the next area. And I always double check by feeling the print or where I've sanded with my fingers to make sure there's no bumps or drips that I missed. So I'm trying something new on a couple of my helmets. I've used this before on other builds, but it just is horrible. It sucks to work with. There's nothing fun about using this. This is the Bondo original filler. So this is a 2-part mixture. You essentially add in the hardener to just the filler itself, and then you apply it on your build. This is pretty much what you want to be using for seam lines or really, really rough areas because this stuff is really thick and it's very durable. It's not going to crack on you like spot putty can. And when it comes to seam lines, this stuff fills them in almost one go. It kind of depends, but it is a pain to sand because it's like sanding a rock. This stuff is incredibly hard, but also I think I just put too much hardener in sometimes because I'm worried if I don't put enough hardener in that it just never dries, and I've had that happen. It's horrible to get off your helmet, but if you want to take the risk, it does do an amazing job at filling in those seam lines very quickly. After sanding down our Bondo original filler, I threw on some filler primer, and then pro tip, I always add filler or specifically Bondo spot putty to the bottom edges of my helmet or any, kind of edges of the helmet where that spaghetti kind of forms when printing. It just makes your helmets look that much more professional, especially if someone's holding it in their hands. And then I just move on to some 400 grit and I just rinse and repeat until it's nice and smooth. Just keep adding filler primer and Bondo spot putty until it's to your desired, quality that you're looking for. I just keep going until there's not an imperfection left. Sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes on certain helmets, you can kind of leave some imperfections, or you don't have to be as tedious if the weathering is going to be very intense or if it's going to add to weathering. After giving a nice base coat of black paint for our helmet, I'm going to start with Vallejo's dark gunmetal. I saw some photos on Instagram of some custom Hot Toys and some other Pre Vizsla helmets. I don't see a lot of people using gunmetal looks, like a dark gunmetal like this. It's just kind of what I see when I look at Pre Vizsla's helmet. It's going to have that gunmetal look. In the Clone Wars, it's kind of hard to tell because it's more of a cartoonish, but I'm going for a very live action look, and these are just the colors that looked best to me and the look that I was going for. People can use grays and blacks like I've seen on other helmets. You can do whatever is going to get the look that you want. But specifically for this video, I'm going to start with some dark gunmetal on the ears and the dome. That's kind of that darker look that we see on his helmet. For the green on Pre Vizla's helmet, I'm using some Vallejo dark green and some Vallejo Stonewall gray. I was going for a very dark, kind of dulled out green look, and I originally had this other color here, but I wasn't really happy with it, so I retaped it up, and I'm using a mix of these colors. It's mostly that dark green with maybe 30% of that Stonewall gray, and I just did a nice thick coat using my airbrush. I used my airbrush quite a bit on this helmet. They were just, I couldn't really find any spray paint colors that were going to fit the vibe I was going for, so I'm using my airbrush for most of this, and then quite a bit of hand painting as well. Now, I didn't really want to tape off the rest of the areas as it was just going to be pretty tedious, and I was going to do a stippling effect on this helmet anyways, so I'm just hand brushing some gunmetal, which just is slightly lighter than the dark gunmetal we used to kind of offset the colors like we see in the Clone Wars. So I'm just hand painting this on, and then we can get into our stippling technique. Taking a slightly different brush, we're going to use the same gunmetal, and we're just going to stipple across everywhere that we painted that gunmetal. This is going to give a slightly textured look and almost give it a little bit of a weathered look, and I'm very happy with the color choice here. I was going my own direction with a very live action look. It may not be totally 100% accurate to what we see in the Clone Wars, but I'm very happy with how this was starting to look. For the antennas on his helmet, I'm using the dark gunmetal, which is going to go right next to the ears. I was debating on the color of these, but I thought the dark gunmetal was the best fit for where they were going to be placed on the helmet. On the front of Pre Vizla's helmet, he is a very obvious symbol. You cannot miss it. It's kind of what gives his helmet its look, in my opinion, that besides the antenna look, that front big yellow symbol that he has. And in order to get this symbol, or at least the easiest method, in my opinion, was to first cut out the shape out of some tape. I used some yellow frog tape. It was very delicate. I did put a satin clear coat over everything just to seal all the paint in before we start weathering and painting. And so after I peeled up that yellow tape, we essentially had a stencil for the symbol, and it was ready to be painted. Before we put that yellow paint on, I did start with some liquid latex. This is going to give us a paint chip effect. We're going to use a couple other techniques, but this gives us a good start to our paint chip and our weathering. I am just stippling this on very lightly. You don't want it to become blotchy because I just feel it looks more unrealistic. So take your time, really make sure nothing blotches up or drips with this liquid latex. You only need a little bit on your brush, especially because this is airbrush paint. It's very thin, so you don't need a thick coat of liquid latex. Then for the yellow, I'm using some moon yellow, some stonewall gray, and a little bit of flat white. I did probably 10% white, 10% gray, and then 80% yellow. And I just airbrushed this on, went on nice and neat. I didn't have any issues, thankfully, because I was worried I was going to get some leakage. I am using some cheap painter's tape because I needed a different color for the stencil, and that was a horrible idea, as you'll see later. Always stick to just nice quality tapes like frog tape. This is where I ran into my first issue, which was I peeled up some of the paint. Even with a satin clear coat, taking my time on the paint, I used some cheap painter's tape because I needed to offset the color for the stencil on the symbol, and maybe I pulled it up too fast. I thought it was going nice and easy. I had no other issues besides that one spot, but I just decided to move forward, not repaint or resand anything. I thought it would add some depth when we go to weather the helmet, but this is what happens when you use cheap tape. At least I know why it happened. I wasn't totally surprised when it happened. I just thought I had a different color frog tape available, and I didn't, so I ended up using the cheap stuff. Then we're going to start peeling up our liquid latex, and I'm also using an X-Acto blade to just touch up any areas where maybe a little bit of yellow leaked through and to help pull up that liquid latex. Now we're going to move on to using a file to add some scratches throughout the helmet. This is going to give us some depth and some texture to the helmet when we begin our weather washes and other detailed weathering. Moving on to our weather wash, I'm just using some black acrylic paint that is heavily watered down, and I'm just spraying it out of an airbrush. I like the look of an airbrush way more with this weather wash. You don't get any brush strokes, and it does give a different look. I don't know how to explain it, but I like it way more, and it's just way easier control. You can still use a brush. Just put this in a cup and just mix up some black and some water, and you'll get the exact same thing. I just think the airbrush provides a little bit more of a realistic touch of weathering. While looking at Pre Vizla's helmet, he has a very textured, weathered scratch kind of all over the metal parts of his helmet. To me, it looked like a gray, or at least I wanted to use a gray, so I started with some Stonewall gray that I darkened with some black because I'm going to layer this with a much lighter gray. And I'm just stippling this and rubbing it along the edges of the entirety of the helmet. I'm putting a little bit of it on the green, but most of it's going to be on the metal. This is very random, and it's just going to help give that weathered look that Pre Vizla has all over. Now we're going to use the Stonewall gray without any black in it to give it a more lighter gray look. This is going to help layer on the weathering, which always gives a more realistic look. When weathering, you want to do it in layers. It's just going to give it that nice professional look, like it's come right off a movie set. And for this light gray, I'm specifically going on the edges a little bit more. I'm almost focusing on the edges to kind of give it a highlight, but I'm still going throughout the helmet with this light gray as well. Same thing with the antennas. We're going to use those same two different grays to just stipple all over those antennas. We want this to match the helmet, and so I just do this for all four pieces so everything's nice and uniform. It was at this point where I decided it needed some silver paint, which I'm using from Vallejo. This stuff is very reflective. It is such a nice silver, and I highly recommend anyone doing projects like this to get this specific silver. It's very good for dry brushing or highlighting edges. It just stands out, especially when it hits the light right. And I'm using this silver very sparingly. I didn't want too much of that silver coming through. I just want it, when it hit the light right, to kind of reflect and show a little bit of a chipped weathering on those metallic areas. Now on to the fun part of this build. I'm going to do some airbrush weathering. You can use brushes for this as well. I just love the effect that an airbrush gives when weathering a helmet. Just gives a more built up dirt look, and it's just such a realistic finish when you're done. I'm starting with some black in the airbrush, and I'm just very lightly going in all the crevices and focusing on random spots throughout the helmet to add darker shades to just give it that used look. We want it to look like it's gone from several different planets. I mean, this is the Star Wars universe. Everyone is always all over the place, so they're going to have a lot of different dirt buildups throughout their gear or their armor. After using the airbrush and some black, I come in with some pastel chalk and some Mod Podge, and just kind of on the top rim of the helmet where I thought dirt would collect a little bit more, I just added that textured dirt throughout that back crevice and along where the antennas are. I just didn't see it building up in the crevices on the cheeks as much because they weren't as sharply angled in. So I left that area with just airbrush weathering and just went for the antenna area as well as that back brim. After putting it on the back brim, I wanted a little bit more weathering on the green, so I took that same pastel chalk and put it in random spots all over the green to look like scratches or maybe scorch marks, to just give that built up dirt look, that added depth. That green, from what I could see, at least in the Clone Wars, is very textured and dirty, and I wanted to represent that on this more live action look. For our last and final stage of the helmet, I'm using some charred brown by Vallejo, and I'm just throwing this in my airbrush and doing the same thing we're doing with the black when we airbrush the helmet. I'm just putting it in random crevices and random spots throughout the helmet because dirt is not all just one color, and this is going to give it a more realistic buildup when it's multiple different colors and shadows and spots. After this, I'm just using a Hobart face shield for the visor that I cut to shape, and then this helmet is all ready to be shown off. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I have a ton more stuff coming out soon, and I really enjoy bringing these videos to you guys. Stay tuned. I also have a cosplay build that I'm breaking up into a couple parts coming out this summer. So, I'll see you in the next one.